Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Rose and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm joined by CEO and Head of Research, Mr. Brunello Rosa. This week, we'll be picking up again the war in Ukraine and unpacking a very key relationship between Russia and China, which is sort of often gone underexplored in the mainstream media. And we'll be discussing the implications of this in the future of the war to come. But Brunello, there's a very important date coming up in the Russian calendar, the date of May 9th. Tell me a bit more about the significance of this day.
Yes, I mean, this is the day in which the Russians celebrate the victory in World War II, which they called the Great Patriotic War under Stalin. The idea was initially that Russia could potentially flag a total victory in Ukraine by that day. I think this was in Putin's initial plans with his attack on the 24th of February. He thought maybe a couple of months would be out of the woods. On the 9th of May, we can celebrate with flags in hand, a victory in what they thought is somehow a Russian province instead of being an independent state. Clearly, things have gone totally in the wrong direction according to these plans, and Ukraine has showed much more fierce resistance than they could ever expect, and the fight continues. The siege of Kyiv has not kind of worked out. The Russians have somehow retreated, if strategically perhaps, and just to concentrate their efforts on Mariupol and the Donbas regions, and they haven't yet conquered Odessa. And so, initial plans clearly proved mistaken.
All right. And what's the Western response been to this? We know that most Western countries are pledging sort of records amounts of military and humanitarian aid. But more importantly, how sustainable is that for sort of short to medium term?
Well, Western alliances, NATO countries at large, provided all sorts of direct and indirect support to Ukraine. Military support, including weapons and logistical kind of aid of any sort, plus supplies to the wider population to endure the atrocities of the war. Just to look at the US, we are talking about something like $3 billion US dollars so far. At least that's the declared part, so to speak. In any war, we know that there's something that is above the line, something is below the line. Other countries have provided an equal amount in terms of their own GDP to the USA. It's extremely active on the field. President Zelensky never forgets to thank very warmly the help he received from the UK. Boris Johnson went there. There are reports that the UK Navy SEALs are in military forces, also because so far most of the weaponry that has been provided has been of Russian/former Soviet Union manufacturing. So because this is what the Ukrainians have been training with, so it's an easy option. But going forward, it's possible that they might need to use arms and weapons from Western manufacturers, so they need to be trained for that. And clearly, the resistance that the army has shown is being backed by some form of Western/NATO intelligence and training.
And let's talk a bit about Putin, sort of the central architect of this war, because I think for decades we've had this assumption that Putin is this very strategic individual. He's often sort of spoken about as if he were a chess player. But increasingly that, assumption has been called into question where, we're questioning his rationality. And as we've seen sort of lots of autocrats across the years, there's a particular last phase when they feel the sense of sort of overwhelming omnipotence. Is that something you see with Putin? And if so, I mean, what are the implications of that?
Yeah, that's, most people started to question the rationality of Putin's choices, whether he was informed or misinformed. Is a sideshow in that respect, because under an autocracy, information is one of the first manipulated aspects of reality, so to speak. Dictators, so to speak, around the globe have always received what they wanted to see rather than the truth on the field. At the beginning of the COVID pandemic, we had exactly the same issue. I mean, it has been said that authorities in Wuhan had detected the virus. It's just the information did not escalate fast enough to the central authority, because they thought they would be punished, they would not receive enough incentives, and so on and so forth. So, question is Putin acting rationally, assuming he's well informed, or not? And we know that all autocrats go through these phases in which they have a vision, however difficult to implement, which eventually gets implemented. But in the third phase, so to speak, of their staying in power, they get this kind of delusion of omnipotence, and they lose contact with reality, and therefore their choices are not based on reality, but on their fictional reality they have in their heads. We don't know whether Putin is in that stage already, but clearly the idea that he might have had in mind, that conquering such a huge territory such as Ukraine with 40 million people in the way he did, that doesn't seem a really well thought through plan. So clearly the rationality of these choices have been put in questions by many people.
Right. Like you mentioned, I mean, Putin's faced several obstacles in trying to sort of invade Ukraine that, he certainly hadn't expected before. But I think a key kind of weapon almost, or relationship that he has on his side that hasn't been exercised yet is the one with China. Now, Putin's asked publicly China to support him, and China sort of maintained quite an odd position of neutrality, even though perhaps de facto it does support Russia. We haven't yet seen any large, sort of material aid, military or otherwise, given to Russia from China. Is that something do you think we can expect in the future? And what would the implications of that be?
So China has had this sort of ambiguous position so far. On the one hand, they want to have Russia and their gas on their side. On the other hand, President Xi knows that it's going to be an extremely difficult client, so to speak, to deal with, Mr. Putin. So effectively, plus the biggest markets of export for China remain the US and the EU, and no Russia, no Southeast Asia or other countries in the region can ever substitute the consumers of last resort the way we can consider the US and the EU at global level. So an alliance between China and Russia would put into question also Xi rationality, so to speak, because it might not be the most rational option. It is a clarifying option to some extent. The world gets divided into two parts. We discussed this several times now, with the EU force, if you want, back into the US camp, in spite of clearly the two lines between the allies. The US is much more in favor of a longer war than the EU. And China has now acquired, so to speak, Russia in his own camp. So there's a clarification, but at the same time, managing a character like Putin, and that oversees such a huge country at global level, is a very difficult proposition for anyone, including a country that, you know, is escalating the world ranking on every respect, such as China, but it still has lots of work to do to get out of what is called the middle income trap.
I mean, you sort of encapsulate that relationship in your views very, very beautifully by referring to an old Chinese saying that states that when the sage points at the moon, the fool looks at the finger. Explain to me the sort of significance of that saying.
Yeah, so the point is, everybody's asking themselves, is Putin acting rationally? And that somehow the finger, compared to the moon, that we should probably all look at, which is China, in a sense, as I was saying, is she acting rationally? Is he now transitioning in this third phase of autocratic leaders in which they lose touch with reality? They enter in this phase where they have this delusion of omnipotence. He changed the constitution to remain in power effectively, indefinitely. He's running for a third mandate as party leader. This is clearly a new phase in the Chinese leadership that was built with this 5 years plus 5 years rounds for presidents and prime minister, and the prime minister that then becomes president. So it was his own way of recycling, so to speak, political personnel in China, which means that different streams of the Communist Party would eventually get control of the party and therefore of the country, even in a single party system. So that entire construct, which she becoming a new sort of lifetime leader, is gone, and with it, the rationality built into that. So the real question is, has China somehow entered a new phase in its growth, in which it's not just this technocratic regime that makes a poor country become a middle-income country and eventually an advanced economy, but has become just an autocracy whose leaders have lost contact with reality, which means that going forward is going to be much harder to deal with them. And we already saw that containing Putin has become extremely complicated for Western democracies, unless they are willing to trigger World War III, as Biden put it. But containing China is virtually impossible, given the technological advancement, the geostrategic advancement, the economic advancement they have made in the last few decades. So I think this is actually the moon we should be looking at, rather than at the finger, in spite, of course, of all the atrocities that we see on a daily basis on newspapers and on the news and TV.
Right. Well, I'm sure our audience will sort of continue to keep our attention on the moon. But as always, Brunello, thank you so much for your thoughts and insight. Very useful.
Thank you very much. Until next time.